If you've ever felt overwhelmed, lost, or defeated when researching the answer to a tax question, my 5-step process shared in this episode is for you. You're listening to the Tax Professionals podcast, the podcast that helps you to become a better UK tax professional. About a month ago, I was in a meeting room on a Teams call with the finance director of a client. And I was on this meeting to talk about whether or not the client was due a £10,000 allowance from government each year, which is basically £10,000 worth of free money. But when this query first came through to me, I didn't know the answer. And so before the meeting, I had to do some research. But in this circumstance, I was short on time, and I was also doing this work for free at this point. So I didn't want to spend too long on it. So as I always do with tax research, I went through my tax research process. And so I started with step 1, which is establishing the scope of the research, which in this case was quite easy. It was just whether or not this client was entitled to the £10,000 allowance called the employment allowance from government each year. That was easy. I then moved on to step 2, which is all about finding applicable information to be able to complete that scope. And in this instance, I knew the legislation that was relevant for the employment allowance and whether or not a business was eligible to have it each year. And I also was able to find HMRC's guidance that's targeted specifically at this point very quickly by just using Google. So I had both of these. And once I got that, I could easily see that the question here, whether or not the client was entitled to this allowance, depended on whether or not they met the criteria to be eligible. That was it. So once I'd done that, I moved on to step 3, which is interpreting and applying the rules and applying them in the circumstance that we have here. And so to do that, I went through each criteria one at a time, bit by bit. And after doing that, there's only one piece of criteria that wasn't clear whether it was met or not. And this is the conclusion I landed upon at this point, and it was the entire crux of this research task. First off, it depended on whether or not the client was a charity, because if they are a charity, then they were definitely due the £10,000 employment allowance. But even if they weren't a charity, then there was another fallback where they would still be due the employment allowance, and that was if they did not carry out functions of a public nature, whatever that means. And it's wording I've come across multiple times in my career today, and every time I come across it, it's been on these non-clear-cut cases, it's basically impossible to come to a definitive conclusion on this, which is super annoying, but it is what it is with research. And so what I got to at this point was I knew that I needed to figure out whether they were a charity, because if they were definitely due the allowance. But if they weren't, I had to figure out whether or not they were carrying out functions of a public nature or not. So what this meant is by this point, I'd basically created a sub-scope. Main scope, are they entitled to the employment allowance or not? Sub-scope, are they a charity or are they carrying out functions of a public nature? Because basically after I got the answer to both of those things, I can come to a conclusion. But on this meeting right now with this finance director, on this Teams meeting, that's where I got to. I hadn't been able to finish that step, that final step, and get to a definitive answer yet for the client. And so I explained to the client on the meeting that that's the crux of this issue here. At the end of the meeting, I told the client that I'll continue looking into this to basically come to an answer for them, but letting them know equally that this was now going to potentially be ambiguous and subjective, and so maybe not a definitive answer, which is not something I ever like to do with clients, because clients like definitive advice, not wishy-washy, caveated advice. But at this point as well, even though I'm doing this work for free and I haven't got much time, I'm now personally invested because I hate it when I don't get to the bottom of a research task. I just, for some reason, can't stop thinking about it until I get to that answer and I get to the end of it. So I'm very invested at this point. I walked out of that meeting back to my desk and I asked a colleague, Ben, who was in the office that day, if he wanted to help with this research or not. And the reason I asked Ben was twofold. He actually handed this query over to me in the first place to help the client. And also, Ben's technically strong, and I thought this type of research would be right up his street. And he did say to me that he did want to help out, and so I agreed with him what needed to be looked at this point. And at this point, I had this very clear sub-scope, which was, is the client carrying out functions of a public nature, or are they a charity? And if we can get the answer to those questions, then that's going to get us to the bottom of this research task. So Ben had a very clear scope to have a look at on the research at this point, coming back to step 1 of my tax research process. So then I left it to Ben to carry out steps 2, 3, and 4 on that sub-scope, which is finding relevant information, analysing and interpreting it, and concluding And over the next few days, as he was doing that, we had a few Teams messages that were going back and forth between us as he was looking into this. And each time we had some back and forth, we were getting closer and closer to the answer. And so from research that I did myself as well, I'd see that you can get recognition from HMRC as to whether a client is a charity or not, but I didn't want to have to go through that process because then it'd take a long time for HMRC to come back along with multiple other reasons. And after we'd had some time to go through this, we had a meeting over Teams together where we discussed where Ben has got to. And this piece of work was one of those instances where it should have been simple to get to the answer, but it really wasn't. And Ben has already dug deep into a lot of areas around this. And so by the end of this chat, me and Ben were pretty sure on the answer, maybe 90% sure of what the answer was, but not 100%. And we agreed some additional areas for Ben to go and have a look at afterwards, and then for him to write up the research and the findings to date so that I could have a look through and determine if we need to do anything else. A few days later, Ben sent the research through to me, and I read through it. And after reading that, I was 95% sure that we'd got the correct answer at this point, but to be 100% sure, there were still a few other bits that needed looking into. And these little bits would probably take hours to look into. But we just didn't really have the time to do that. And because the client wasn't paying for this work at this point, there was a decision as to whether we tell them where we've got to and that we agree a fee with them, which probably not going to be favourable by them, or I suppose we let them know that we're 95% sure, and hopefully that's good enough for them at this point. But Ben did have a brainwave. The client had already applied to HMRC to see whether or not HMRC would recognise them as a charity. And HMRC had come back with a letter and had said that they did agree that this client was a charity. And that wasn't slam dunk to make us know that they were a charity for the employment allowance rules that we're now dealing with. But within the letter, it said that they were a charity as per a specific definition, which was the exact same definition as we had here with the employment allowance. And because we knew that HMRC had accepted that they were a charity for that definition, we conclude that they were a charity for the employment allowance rules. And we got to our definitive answer for the client, which was the result. One of those cases where it should have been easy, but again, it wasn't. But by following my 5-step tax research process and having Ben go through that tax research process as well, we were able to go from not knowing the answer to getting to what we thought was probably the right answer, all the way to being able to be 100% sure on what the right answer was. Huge result. So just to be clear, this is my 5-step process for tax research. First off, step 1, set the scope. Then once you've set the scope, you can move on to finding applicable and relevant information, which is step 2. You can then move on to step 3, which is to interpret and apply that information to the case that you have in hand. Then you can move on to step 4, which is make conclusions, and then move on to step 5, which is documenting the research. And that's the 5-step process. The process that allowed us to get to the bottom of this client query in this case methodically and without getting overwhelmed and completely lost for direction. As you can see in this case, the scope actually got broken up into a sub-scope, which often happens when you're doing research, but equally the 5-step process was then applied to the sub-scope. I started off with a 5-step process on the overall scope to narrow it down to get that sub-scope. Let's just dive a little bit deeper in relation to each of those 5 steps. So step 1, establishing the scope. So basically, you want to make sure that you are clear on what it is that you're trying to find the answer to, because the scope is what's going to give you the direction for the rest of the research. You can end up having the sub-scopes, as we've talked about, but you should have an overarching scope and then potentially multiple sub-scopes. And you might not know of all the sub-scopes until you start going down the track of completing the research task. So step 2 is find applicable and relevant information. So this is primarily about finding the applicable tax rules and find information to be able to know what those tax rules are, and then to be able to apply them to the circumstance that you got, understand the rules and apply them. That's what step 2 is about. It's about finding that information out. And it also includes finding information related to the circumstance that you're dealing with. So if you've got an exact specific client scenario, then getting facts related to that is also part of this step, because you need that information to be able to apply the rules and to be able to know which rules are applicable and relevant and so forth. Step 3, which is interpreting and applying those rules and the information that you found. This is all about taking that information that you found that is relevant, taking the facts of the client case or the situation that you're dealing with, and actually applying it to that specific case. So going from knowing the relevant rules knowing the relevant facts, to coming to an answer. So interpreting and applying comes immediately before concluding, and they kind of happen simultaneously, but that directly leads on to step 4, which is towards the end of step 3. And step 4 is then coming to the conclusions based on that relevant information, based on the relevant facts, and based on the application of those rules, those facts, to come to conclusions, which is step 4. Then step 5 is literally just about capturing something to either put on the file or send to the client that explains your conclusion and how you've got there, essentially. There's more detail to it than that overall, but that is the bare bones of it. So hopefully that gives you enough information to get a bit of a gist of each of those 5 steps and to understand what each one of them is about. Okay, so now you know the 5-step process, and you might be thinking that I've made it sound like it's easy. And I just want to acknowledge that I know that tax research is not easy. And even though you've got that process now, it's not going to make everything completely plain sailing moving forward. It will make your life easier with tax research. It will help you do a better job, but it doesn't solve every single one of the problems. So there's quite a few things that people find difficult in relation to this. In relation to step 2 of the process, which is all about finding the applicable and relevant information for the question, for the scope of work that you're dealing with. The typical challenges here are around where do you actually start that research? Like, you've got the scope and you know you need to find information, but where do you start looking for information so that you can do this efficiently and the most time effectively? That's a typical challenge. And also, people tend to find it difficult to actually find the relevant legislation in question as well. So those are 2 typical challenges that I see around step 2 of the process. In relation to step 3 of the process, which is about interpreting and analysing those rules, that information that you've looked at to then come to a conclusion, what I find people find most challenging there is being able to actually understand what it is that they're reading and then being able to apply that to the exact circumstances you have and come to a conclusion. And that's something that a lot of people find difficult, and it's been very challenging on a lot of research tasks I've done as well. In relation to the documenting of it, I tend to find that people just brain dump everything into like a Word document or into some written notes that they've done. But the thing is, that might be useful to show that there's a bunch of information there. But if you want to put something on file for your manager to review or for someone else to look at in the future and understand how you got to the answer, then you need a much more structured approach to basically make it very clear what was being looked at, what the relevant conclusions are, and why. And I find that people find it difficult to do that in a succinct, clear way that other people can follow their thought process and reach the same answer as them. So those are just some challenges that people face in relation to different elements of the tax research process. Yours might be different, but those are the typical ones that I see. If you'd like to learn how to properly complete each step of my 5-step tax research process, then take a look at my Tax Research Masterclass after this episode by heading on over to thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/TRM. That's thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/TRM. And TRM just stands for Tax Research Masterclass. The next time you need to research the answer to a tax question, start by establishing the scope of the research and then go through my 5-step process to complete that scope of work and go from not knowing the answer all the way to knowing the answer and having it documented. Hopefully, following that story and what we've talked about in this episode so far, you can see how my 5-step approach to tax research reduces the chances of you being overwhelmed, getting lost, or even feeling defeated with your tax research. By the time I was senior manager, I had worked with many people new to tax, and all seemed to find tax research difficult. And that stopped me from delegating research tasks and meant that they couldn't progress in their career as quickly as they could have. I know tax research is hard, and that's why many people avoid it. But there were no courses out there teaching it, none that I could find anyway. So when I decided to create my first course, the Tax Research Masterclass, it was an obvious choice. The Masterclass teaches you the practical skills to confidently find and justify the answers to any tax question, including how to use tax legislation. Since launching the Tax Research Masterclass, over 150 people have taken it, and their feedback means it keeps getting better. That means if you join the next one starting on the 24th of September 2025, you'll be getting the best version yet. Go to thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/TRM for details and to enrol. go to thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/TRM, where TRM stands for Tax Research Masterclass. If you're listening to this episode in a podcast player, then you can get a link to the show notes and the Tax Research Masterclass by going to the details of this episode within that podcast player. Or you can access the show notes by heading on over to thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/TTPP122. That's thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/TTPP122. And TTPP122 stands for the Tax Professionals Podcast, episode 122. But that is it for this episode of the Tax Professionals Podcast. If you like this episode, chances are you'll like at least one more of the other 121 episodes. But I hope you found this episode useful and have taken away something that will help you to progress, develop, and improve your tax career. Until next time.